Welcome, everyone, to our discussion today. My name is Sheila Amo, and I am the Chief Administrative Officer at AAUW, and I will serve as the moderator for today's discussion. At a time when there's so much discussion on diversity, inclusion, and equity, we thought it would be a good idea to have a talk about exploring the subject of, is your perspective inclusive? So this webinar is made possible through the generous support of GEICO. If you're an AAUW member, you could be eligible for AAUW's GEICO member discount check. Check out the website that pops up in your default web browser to learn more. If the GEICO website does not appear in your browser, just let us know in the chat box and we'll send you a link. So I wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping items before we dive into the material. All participants will be muted. The chat box is something that should be used for any sort of technical difficulties. So if you're having problems, let us know through the chat box. And then the Q&A should be used for substantive questions. And we will go through the discussion and try to pick out some of those questions that are in the Q&A so that we can answer them while we have our panelists with us today. It's going to be, as I said, a moderated discussion. And then at the end, if there is additional time, we'll have some Q&A then. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists. So today we have with us Dr. Lisette Garcia. She is the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility. Dr. Garcia, is responsible for the ongoing operations of the organization, as well as the functionality of its research, programs, and initiatives to drive sustainable growth. In addition to overseeing HACR Corporate Inclusion Index, Dr. Garcia takes the lead in facilitating the organization's investigative projects and developing new programs and research studies aimed at strengthening HACR's reputation as the key source for information on Hispanic inclusion in corporate America. Additionally, we have with us Pamela Fuller. Pamela is the Global Client Partner and Thought Leader for Inclusion and Bias at Franklin Covey. Pamela's work has always been tied to issues of inclusion with an emphasis on exploring the impacts of bias and pushing just a bit in order to make progress. She helps global clients by designing tailored programs to help them achieve their goals. And Pamela is a phenomenal speaker and can now add to that list author with the upcoming book, The Leader's Guide to Unconscious Bias: How to Reframe Bias, Cultivate Connection, and Build High-Performance Teams. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Pamela and Dr. Garcia to say a few words before we get started.
Thanks, Sheila. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. As Sheila mentioned, I work at the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility, which is a nonprofit organization that helps companies to develop and refine their Hispanic inclusion strategies. And that's my day job. And in my free time, I work with Sheila and the team at AAUW as the chair of the Inclusion and Equity Committee, which works to talk with branches and members about diversifying their branches, attracting new members, making their environment welcoming and inclusive, and just really trying to provide resources and support for members and branches around topics relating to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thanks so much, Sheila. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Sorry. You go ahead, Pamela.
So I'm excited to be here with all of you, really honored to have been invited and excited to talk to Dr. Garcia and you, Sheila, about this. As you mentioned, I'm with Franklin Covey. Franklin Covey is a global company focused on performance improvement and predominantly through learning and development. And so I'm dual-hatted there. I am one of our global sales leaders. I am also our thought leader around inclusion and bias. And that means that I spend a good bit of my time working with intact teams and executives and leaders around how bias impacts their organizational performance, their team dynamics, and how their employees are showing up. And really pushing them to ask the question, does my behavior limit the possibilities of anyone on my team or limit their performance in any way? And if so, really examining that and being proactively inclusive in their behaviors. I'm also the architect of our training program on the subject of bias. And as Sheila mentioned, run around the world when we're not in COVID doing training and facilitation around this subject. So really thrilled to be with you all today.
Thank you both so much. We are thrilled and privileged to have you here with us. And so we're going to go ahead and dive right in. And so my first question for both of you is, what is perspective and how is it shaped?
So, Pam, I don't know how you want to do it. If you want to take a stab, I'll take a stab after you. Or
Sure. So, I think our perspective is born from everything that's been poured into us over our lifetime. And it is how we examine and respond to a circumstance or situation, right? It is everything from the fact that I am a first-generation American to the fact to where you grew up, your culture, your context, your religion, your education, right? The way that an engineer looks at problems and looks at other people is different than how an attorney might do that, is different than how someone with an MBA might look at those problems, right? And so everything that's been poured into us over our lifetime formulates our perspective and our context. The perspectives I have in my home life might be slightly different than some of the perspectives I have at work. And I think these perspectives essentially become our biases, right? They are the lens through which we look at circumstances and situations. And they don't necessarily have value on their face, but they do impact our behavior and whether we are sort of opening the aperture, whether we're inclusive in that behavior or whether we're leaving someone out of the conversation.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, one of the things that I would add is that in essence, it's our frame, right? Our perspective is how we see things. And that frame shapes the value that we attribute to other things, right? It shapes the value that we assign to things like culture, to talent, to beliefs, to background, just, to name a few things, right? And so when we think about perspective and we think about sort of how it not only is shaped, but how it shapes other things, it's sort of this double-edged sword, right? It is who we are and it makes us who we are, right? But it also then influences how we see others and assigns sort of what is considered to be normal, and what is considered to be not, right? If it is outside of what our perspective is, if it's unknown to us, if we've never encountered it, then we're going to think about it differently than we would if it was something that we were used to seeing, if it was something that was common or part of our everyday life. And that sort of creation of what is normal versus what is not then leads us to, as Pam was saying, to have these biases, right? To feel certain ways about certain things that we're used to versus things that we're not used to.
Oh, you're muted, Sheila.
Thank you. Thanks, Pamela. So thank you both for that insight. I would say this leads me into our next question about what is unconscious bias, right? Because you hear that term bandied about quite a bit. And so, and Pamela, your book speaks specifically to unconscious bias. And so why don't you start off by telling us, what is unconscious bias?
Yeah, so you've certainly heard a lot about unconscious bias or cognitive shortcuts or even implicit bias. They're all interchangeable words to describe a similar thing, right? Or the same thing. And our biases are, for our purposes, we define biases at Franklin Covey as simply our preferences. They're preferences in favor of or against a thing or person or place. And these preferences can be held by individuals, they can be held by teams, they can be held by organizations, or even larger society, right? Has preferences about, to Lisette's point, about what is valuable and what we value. And as we work with organizations and individuals to make progress on bias, we really focus on the idea that our biases impact our behaviors. And those behaviors have a consequence, right? Those behaviors are either limiting or expanding. They're either inclusive or they're exclusive. And it's important for all of us to build the muscle of self-awareness to be able to do the sort of analysis and introspection that gives us the answer to that question. What is the impact of my behavior? How does my bias or my frame or lens impact my behavior? And what is that consequence? I also think it's really important that when we're talking about unconscious bias, we do not negate the reality that there's very real unconscious bias in the world. So I think one of the unintended consequences of discussion around bias is that people will tell me, well, I have an unconscious bias against women in leadership positions or against, men who take their paternity leave, right? I have an unconscious bias about that. Well, once you have stated it, it is no longer unconscious, right? It is out in the world. You are responsible for it. You own it. And you need to think critically about what that means for the person or that you're addressing.
I think that's a great point, and a great distinction. Thank you, Pamela. Dr. Garcia?
So I think, as I think about unconscious bias, I don't necessarily have anything to add to the definition of what it is and how we see it. And I think, to Pam's last point is once you articulate what it isn't unconscious anymore. You are fully aware of those stereotypes or those biases that you have. But what I will say that one of the things that I think is important for us to think about and to talk about, because I think the end goal in this conversation is that we really want to be promoting inclusion, right? At the end of the day, our goal here is to try and help people be more inclusive in what they're doing. And oftentimes, I think one of the biggest sort of hurdles, we're talking about unconscious bias and we're talking about perspective, is that the way we normally see things is from a perspective of difference, right? We normally see I am one way and you are not that way. And because you are not that way, it's seen as being bad. And so as we're talking about perspective and talking about, sort of what makes it inclusive or not, I think it's important for us to really think about that frame and how we see it as a deficit, as opposed to seeing it as what it is. Like, it could be such a great advantage and such a great opportunity for us to be doing something different, or for us to be learning or growing. And I think that's often what gets missed in all of these discussions, right? Like, we talk about what people don't have or what they don't do, and how that's bad, instead of thinking about difference as something that could be supplementing what we're doing. It can be something that benefits, say, the education system or our workplaces or our branches or whatever it might be, right? And I think that, when we start thinking about it from that perspective, we really start to get a different appreciation for it.
Thank you, Dr. Garcia. That was awesome. So as we talk about things like unconscious bias, and we are looking to do some self-exploration around whether or not our perspective is inclusive, I think it's important to add to this conversation the difference that you see between equality and equity. those words come up a lot when we're talking about diversity, inclusion, and intersectionality. And so let's talk a little bit about what the differences are between equality and equity. Pamela, would you like to start?
Sure. So I think the primary difference as we look at the definition of the words as equality is that we give everyone the same thing, right? And that assumes that everyone has the same starting point, right? And the same faculties, the same advantages, the same Dolly Chugg, who wrote a wonderful book called The Person You Need to Be, talks about headwinds and tailwinds, right? And equity recognizes the reality that each of us has different headwinds and tailwinds, that we are starting from different places, that there are barriers and advantages that define our possibilities and what our futures look like. And so equality is, I think through that lens, it's more complex. Equity is more complex than equality because it accounts for the reality of our society, that people have had advantages and disadvantages that impact, enhance, or limit their possibilities.
Great, thank you. Dr. Garcia, did you want to expand on that at all?
Well, so I was just thinking about it from the perspective of, and I'm sure everyone has seen, there's like a drawing out there where it's three kids who are at a fence trying to look over the fence, right? And I'm a visual person, so for me, it's always helpful to see something like that. And, in that particular image, the three kids have boxes that are of different.
All right, so it looks like we're totally back. Just waiting for the slides to be put back on. I think at the time we were booted off, Dr. Garcia, you were talking about the image of the two kids or the three kids and explaining equity versus equality. So,
yes. So I was talking about that image that I'm sure everyone is familiar with now. And because I'm a visual person, it just always helps me to think about what it might look like. So when we think about the difference between equality and equity, in that image, the equality is everybody having one box. But because they're not all the same height, everyone having one box doesn't help every little person in that video to see over the fence, right? So equity would mean distributing those boxes in a way so that everyone can see over that fence, right? And that's really, I think, the difference between equality and equity. And, it's not all that dissimilar from thinking about the difference between systematic and systemic, right? I think that those are two additional words that sometimes people have trouble with when they're talking about it, right? So systematic is something that you do according to a system, hence the word, or an organized method, right? So if you think about maybe you eat M&Ms, and if you sort all the M&Ms by color and then eat the blue M&Ms last, every time you eat M&Ms, that is a systematic way of eating M&Ms, versus systemic, which describes something that happens inside of a system, affects all parts of that system, and can also sometimes be used to describe something that's deeply ingrained into a system. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about systemic social problems or systemic political issues or something along those lines, right?
Great, thank you. And so I'm looking at a couple of the questions that have come in, and one of them is asking about the relationship between implicit bias and the concept of white privilege. And so they simply ask, what is the relationship there? So,
I have to think about that. I don't know, Lisette, if you have an answer without thinking. I think white privilege is the idea that, and that you have advantages, natural privileges as a result of being white, right? And privilege can exist around education, it can exist around gender, and then of course it can exist around whiteness, right? In our society in particular. And I think that privilege influences a lot of our biases, right? So Lisette used the word value earlier, right? That our biases impact where we see value. And having white privilege could mean that you see a circumstance of equality where everyone's given the same thing and believe that to be equity, right? Believe that to be sufficient because you have had privileges that people, Black and Indigenous people of color, may not have had based on the systemic disadvantages built into lots of our systems, how people are educated, what neighborhoods they live in, what opportunity looks like for different groups of people in this country. So I think that having privilege means that you may be blind to the challenges or disadvantages that people have had, and then you undervalue them as a result. You think, well, they should be able to accomplish everything I should be able to accomplish based on our life story. It sort of moves your lens from recognizing the collective societal view to looking at a very individual level. Well, they should be able to, right? Looking at them as having some sort of deficit because they don't have the privilege that you might have through whiteness. What would you add, Lisette?
Well, I think I just would pick up on that last point, Pam. And I think, one of the things that makes Americans so unique is that individualistic idea, in that idea that, we are all sort of in control of what our destiny is, right? That is one of our sort of defining cultural norms as Americans. And I think that when you think about that and it lends itself to not thinking about all of the things that go into that. And in terms of what we're talking about, when you think of the relationship between unconscious bias or implicit bias and white privilege, right? Because we are an individualistic society for the most part, we forget that some people haven't had access to the same things, that some people haven't had the same advantages, or the opposite of that, which is that some people have had different situations, have had different experiences, have had, to my point from earlier, right? We always look at difference one way. They don't see the opposite side of that, right? They don't see what those experiences may have allowed for or not allowed for, right? And I think that that's sort of ingrained into our society. And until we start to think about it differently, I think we're challenged as a whole to try and really, truly understand unconscious bias, implicit bias, and get beyond it, right? And I see someone's asking a question about intersectionality, and I think that that's just one additional element for us to think about, right? So oftentimes when we talk about things, it's this or that, but what if it's this, that, and the other thing? Right? So I am a woman, I am also a person of color, and those two things mean different things in our society. And it's the intersection of those things that shape the experiences that I've had in my life. And because of that, my experience is not going to be the same. And certainly, I am Latina, but I'm also a very light-skinned Latina who, in many cases, and when people don't know my name, they assume that I'm white. And that shapes the interactions that we have, right? And so because of that, and because of that intersectionality, I think, we are each uniquely positioned to be able to contribute and to be able to interact in different ways. And we have to be conscious of that.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks for actually looking in that chat box or the Q&A, Lisette, and answering that question. I appreciate it. And so I want to just pause for a minute to thank everyone for jumping back on the webinar. We had some technical difficulty, and so we appreciate you bearing with us and coming back on. So One of the things that I think about as I listen to both of you talk about unconscious bias and intersectionality is what is at stake if we don't have an inclusive perspective. And we can talk about that from an individual standpoint as well as from an organizational standpoint. So whichever one of you wants to jump in on this, that would be great.
Why don't you go ahead, Lisette? I've answered first on all of them. So.
I have no preference either way. I think when we think about what's at stake, gosh, where do you even start, right? Like I just think about opportunity. And I think about the lost opportunity when we're not inclusive, when we exclude others. I think about how much potential there is in what's unknown to us and what's different from us in terms of thought leadership, in terms of innovation. I just came from a webinar about STEM and Hispanic inclusion in STEM, and we were talking about how, colleges and universities are diversifying at unprecedented rates, and Hispanics are declaring STEM majors at rates that are on par with some of their non-Hispanic peers. But when you look at degree completion, there is a significant drop-off between who declares a major and who actually completes that degree. And, we were having a conversation about why that happens. And the why is certainly important, but the at what cost also becomes important, right? So who are we hurting? How are we not taking advantage of everything that's out there for us to leverage when we're not inclusive, right? And I think for me, that's one of the greatest missed opportunities when we think about not being inclusive and continuing to be excluding in what we do.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would add, there is a wealth of business case data, right, around the value of diversity and equity and inclusion and belonging. When people feel that they're on the receiving end of bias, they're 3 times as likely to withhold ideas, 3 times as likely to be disengaged, and 3 times as likely to leave their position within a year. And to Lisette's point, that's unquantifiable. Like withheld ideas are unquantifiable. And so the way that I've thought about it from a societal level, we think of our current challenge, right? And we think of how many people are being left out of opportunity or not given opportunity. The vaccine for COVID could live in someone's head who never got the chance to be in the right lab, to get the funding, to do the research, to get the degree. Right? Like we as a society have all these challenges, businesses and organizations have all kinds of challenges, big questions that really smart people are trying to figure out. But there's a whole class of people who are being left out of that conversation. I was at a global and a UN International HR conference last year. And one of the speakers was the head of recruiting and talent for a tech company. And he said, it's a room of HR recruiters, and he said, there is no war for talent. So collective gasp in the room. They're like, oh, there is, of course, a war for talent, right? But his point was, there's not a war for talent. There's a war for the profile that you're looking for. You're all looking for the same people. You're not looking for veterans trying to re-enter the workforce or people who've stayed at home raising their children or people who don't have formal education or don't have prestigious formal education, right? Your job announcement doesn't say someone who took 12 years to complete their degree because they did 18 other things. It says, it has the specifics and you have an expectation and what you value or what you see as similar to you, right? And so I think that the consequences is unquantifiable in that macro sense. I think at an individual level, this reality of our brain, that one of the automatic systems in our brain is this idea of categorization. And it just comes from our, like, that reptilian survival part of our brain that says things that are like us keep us safe, and things that are just like, things that are different are dangerous. That's how we die, right? And so our brain does that, even though that's not the current reality that we live in. It says good, bad, like me, unlike me, and it sort of throws away the bad. One of the ways that we can hijack that is by sort of opening the tent of our experiences. So the more sort of narrow and uniform your life is in terms of the perspectives that you take in, the kind of people you surround yourself with, right? The more difficult it is for you to expand that sorting function. And the reality is that if you actually get to know people beyond what you see on the surface, beyond that snap initial judgment, that you will find something about them that is similar to your own experience. So it might not be that we had the same upbringing from the same place or studied the same thing or have the same family structure. But if we actually invest time and energy in building meaningful relationships outside, across difference, if you will, if we go beyond tolerating difference and putting up with it, which is what I think the diversity and inclusion space pushed for many years, then we find that we are saying yes to more people. We are saying like me, like me, like me, like me, and there's more diversity in that group. So I think it expands not just like the fabric of your life, but it also means that when we hear data like 71% of leaders select proteges of the same race and gender, right? This is how we hijack that. And we build close relationships with people who might not be exactly like us and see that hidden potential, if you will, or something that we wouldn't have valued on the surface.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for that insight. I want to get to a question that was posted before we got booted off the call. And that was someone asking about the distinction between fighting against bias versus becoming aware of bias and safeguarding against the potential harmful impacts. So I think it's a pretty nuanced distinction, but I'd like to ask either of you to comment on that. And really, the second part of that question is, which is more important, right? So fighting against it or becoming aware of it?
I think fighting against bias is a defensive posture. And what you spend a lot of your time and energy doing if you're fighting against bias is defending against whether you have it or not. Right? You're worried that you might be seen as a bad person. You're worried that you might have guilt or shame, right? If anyone's a fan of Brene Brown, you're worried about that level of vulnerability and acknowledging that you may have a bias that is potentially problematic. So I was hiring a couple years ago, and we had won a very large contract that required staffing, and the company just wasn't moving as quickly as the contract was moving. And so my whole team was really stretched doing multiple jobs. We finally get approval to hire for a position, and we hire this young woman, and she accepts the job and then says, "What is your maternity leave policy? I'm pregnant." And I was like, "No, you're not." Like, it was not my finest hour, right? I mean, I have 2 children. At the time, my youngest was he was under 2. Like I literally could smell maternity leave, right? I had just come off of maternity leave. And in that moment, I had an unconscious bias that came to consciousness, right? It smacked me in the face that I actually, as much as I would never want to be judged harshly, as much as I had a really lovely experience from my boss and team when I took maternity leave, in that moment, I had a bias that I was ashamed of. And that could have very significantly impacted what her onboarding looked like and what her whole opportunity and possibility looked like at Franklin Covey. And so had I been focused on fighting against bias, I would have been too ashamed to even acknowledge I had a feeling there. But because I was focused on building the self-awareness to think critically about what that meant and then be proactive in how I treated her and how I responded next, I think that moment of decision completely transformed our collective experience as, employee and manager over the last 3 years, right? And so I think fighting against bias is a defensive position. And I think being aware of bias and acting, proactively to mitigate whatever harmful effects might come from our biases is the proactive decision. It's the thing that helps us make progress.
I would agree. I think, to your point, Pam, when you were talking, I wrote down two things that struck me, proactive and thinking critically. And I think when you think of anything that I have to fight against it, the image that conjures up in your mind is not one that I think is going to get you far in this case, right? Like, I think it then becomes a us versus them mentality, which I'm not sure that's necessarily the perspective that you want to take when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in many cases now, companies, are adding belonging into the mix, right? There are a lot of companies, are now working to ensure that their culture is one that where people feel like they truly are part of the team, like their voice is heard and they're incorporated into all aspects. And I think when you position it as, fighting against versus becoming aware, it changes how other people see it. And since I think that this isn't something that we can necessarily accomplish as individuals, I think that this is a collective effort. I think, we need to be very intentional with our words and be very intentional with that critical thought behind it. And I'm not saying we shouldn't fight against certain things. Please don't misinterpret what I'm saying. I think there is a time and a place for that. But I also think that, as we're thinking about it and thinking about all of the things that are going on around us, I think there is definitely a new appreciation for awareness. I think there's a new appreciation for thinking logically and critically about how to make impactful change. And that if we continue to view it as a battle, I think we're going to continue to be met with resistance.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both for that. That was very thoughtful. I have a question that's come in through the Q&A that's asking about whether there isn't something that exists that's a reverse bias against those who have more privilege. That if you have privilege, you can't possibly understand and practice inclusion. So I think the question is asking whether or not there's I guess, the assumption that people who have privilege can't practice diversity and inclusion and can't be aware about what unconscious bias is and actively take steps to grow that awareness and be proactive, as we were just discussing.
So I don't agree with that, right? I don't think that just because you have had privilege in your life that means that you can't possibly be aware of inclusion and practice inclusion in your behaviors. Well, because if that were the case, I think we'd have a really difficult time. I think we'd be in a lot of trouble if that were really the case, to be honest, right? Like, I think, in fact, as I think about the work that we do and, at Hacer, in my day job, we work a lot with CEOs, and I think we'd all be hard pressed to say that those CEOs haven't had some kind of privilege throughout their life, even if it wasn't necessarily from the get-go, but earned later on, right? And many of the folks that we work with, they are the biggest champions within their companies for that diversity, for those inclusion efforts, and for making sure that their employees feel like they're part of the team and that they belong. And they're our greatest allies, right? And so I think that, the fact that you have recognized that you have privilege is an important first step, right? Because I think the problem comes in when people who have had privilege in their life don't recognize it, and then don't think that there's anything they can do, or that there's anything, period, that can be done about it. So I would certainly say that it's not, there isn't this reverse feeling about it, and certainly folks who have it can be part of the solution.
Thank you, Lisette. I agree with you. I think that's an important point to make. And to some extent, we all have some level of privilege, right? And so that privilege does not exclude us from being aware and being willing to make a change and make a difference where this subject is concerned. So, Pamela, do you want to add anything?
I do also, I thought I'd take a minute just to talk about reverse, right? Reverse bias, reverse discrimination. I mean, I think you even hear it like reverse mentorship, right? If the person doing the mentoring is younger than the person they are mentoring. And I just think we need to remove the word reverse. Like, bias is bias, whether it's biased against a white person or a Black person or a man or a woman, it's just bias. As same with discrimination, right? The law around discrimination doesn't say discrimination specifically for people of color. It says based on race, right? And white is a race. It's in there. So I think the idea of reverse discrimination becomes limiting in the conversation, because there are some inherent assumptions around what the discrimination or bias is about that make people, I think, defensive about their race. And it's not helpful, because bias against white people is not necessarily different than bias against Black people. I know everyone right now is reading How to Be an Anti-Racist, right? Ibram Kendi has a whole chapter on anti-white racism, and he doesn't call it reverse racism, right? He calls it anti-white racism. So I think vocabulary and being intentional about that language is really important. I would also just co-sign and agree with everything Lisette said, that I think having privilege of any form, and particularly white privilege, doesn't mean, I don't think in identifying the privilege, anyone is saying that a white person cannot identify their biases and make progress. So I think that goes back to the defensive posture, that there's still a lot of people who hear the term white privilege and feel the need to defend against that characterization, because they feel that it invalidates their life experience and their work ethic, and that they've had struggle. And that's not what privilege is. I mean, I have had significant privilege in my life, right? My mom has a college degree. I had both of my parents very involved in my life. We were of a certain socioeconomic status I didn't want for anything. So I have had socioeconomic privilege. I am privileged to be married to a man, right? In my orientation, that is a privilege. I've not had privilege around being Black, right? my being Latina or Black or woman, I haven't had privilege around those things, but I've had significant privilege around other things. And the privilege I've had doesn't invalidate that I've had struggle or that I work hard. So I think that it just goes back to what we were saying earlier around having a proactive position or having a defensive position. And if we're thinking about privilege through a defensive lens, then we can't possibly make progress on it. But if we can be open to the fact that we've had advantages and that does impact our worldview, and be open to what other people who haven't had those advantages has to share with us and tell us and help us learn, then we can absolutely be advocates for change and make change, right, in the biases that we hold.
Yeah. So I think, Pamela, that's a good segue into the next question, which is, what is my role in perpetuating exclusion?
I would hope you're not playing a role in perpetuating exclusion. Right?
I think so. I think when I think about that question, I think about what role am I playing? I come back to something that you just said, Pam, which is that you have to recognize, right? Like, you have to recognize your own biases. You have to recognize your own advantages that you've had. And I think if you are blind to those, then you are perpetuating exclusion, right? Like, so I said it earlier, I grew up in an affluent white suburb in New Jersey. My whole life, people thought I was just the average white person walking down the street. And then I got to college, and because I had checked a certain box on my application, I was in a minority counseling program. I had a special minority advisor that met with me once a week to make sure I was adjusting to being on a predominantly white campus okay. I was too white for the other Hispanic people and too Hispanic for the white people there, right? And until that period of my life, I never knew. I never knew. I was not aware of my own advantages or disadvantages or biases because I had never had to think about it before. I am now in a committed relationship with an African American individual. We co-parent 2 children who do not look anything like me. And I am acutely aware that this 12-year-old boy, when he goes to the store with me and I buy my Diet Coke or whatever it might be and drop it in my purse, that I can do that. But if he buys a drink and sticks it in his pocket, he can't, right? I am keenly aware of that now in my life because these are things that I have to be aware of, right? And I think that that's it. Like the more that you are not aware, then the greater role you're playing in perpetuating it.
That's right.
I agree. And I think that it is that intentional use of language, right? Like what role, when I think about leadership, many leaders think about how they can be a great leader. They think about they think about the power dynamic on their team and how do I really ensure that my people know that my open door policy means I really want feedback, and what language do I use in performance evaluations and all of this. I think fewer leaders think about what it means to be an inclusive leader. And if you are not an inclusive leader, your leadership is not great. It just can't be great because people are being left out. And so I think that same language is what I would use to respond to the question. Your role is to be proactively inclusive, right? It is radical inclusion. How can I ensure that at every moment in everything that I say, I'm really thinking about what the impact of that is and what it means? And I think that some of the visceral feedback from that is like, well, that feels exhausting, right? That in every moment I always have to be thinking about it. But I would venture to say that it's probably more exhausting for people who feel like they're constantly on the receiving end of negative bias, right? And there's lots of things that we think about every day because we find them important and we value them. And so I think if we value this, then we have a responsibility to think about what we're doing every day to move it forward. An analogy I would make is the environment. Like everyone agrees that there are things that you do that are positive for the environment and things that you do that are negative for the environment. And there's never, no one is out there saying, no, there are lots of things that are environment neutral, right? Like no one is making that argument. They're like, no, your Tesla is better for the environment. Your gas car is worse, right? If you recycle, that's better. And if you don't, it's worse. And I think that's true around the negative impacts of bias, whether it's race or gender or other characteristics and other marginalized groups, is that we can be proactively supporting a society and organizations and workplaces that are radically inclusive, or in our lack of action or even unintentional negative action, we're supporting a society that is more exclusive. And so I think that's a choice and a lens that each of us can make that can make a profound impact.
Thank you, Pamela. One of the things that you touched on in that response was leadership qualities or leadership traits. And so I want to pick that up with Dr. Garcia, just to weigh in and talk a little bit more about the traits of inclusive leaders.
So I think, when I think about what makes a good inclusive leader, the traits that they exhibit, I think certainly they have to be aware of their own biases. I think you can't be a good inclusive leader if you don't recognize your own personal blind spots. I think you need to be aware of that. And I think, that then leads you to also recognize whether or not the system is perfect, right? And I think that when you recognize that you have your own biases, you also begin to recognize that maybe that there are problems with the system. And whether that system is, say, an educational system, or even the work we do on a daily basis is systems of promotion within companies, and who gets promoted and how, that sometimes those systems are flawed. And if you can't recognize that, then you're not a good inclusive leader. I would also say that an inclusive leader is someone who has an appreciation and an understanding for cultural intelligence, right? So understanding others' cultures, understanding and being open to hearing about cultural differences, and really trying to figure out what that means in terms of how do I adapt, right? What does that mean for me? How does that influence the expectations that I have? And I don't mean that in a negative way. I think it's that issue of awareness, right? Maybe it's something I've never thought about. Maybe it's something I've never been exposed to. I think it helps to sort of increase your own awareness. And I would say maybe just a third trait for an inclusive leader, someone who's a good communicator. I think communication is an underrated skill. I think that, as time has passed and generations have changed, there are different styles of communication. And I think that if you are not able to adapt to those different styles, and then I think that goes both ways. I think that that's not just that, I'm Gen X and my workforce is predominantly not. They're Gen Zs, and they communicate in a very different way than I do. And it has meant that I have had to learn what works for them, but I think that it's also meant that they have to learn what works for me in terms of communication, that it isn't just always a one-way thing, that, there is a give and a take here. So I'd say those are probably three key traits of inclusive leaders for me.
Pamela, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure. So I think as I think about inclusive leadership, I think an intense, insane curiosity is really critical. I mean, it's not, I mentioned earlier, like D&I for so long pointed to tolerance. It's that we would tolerate one another. And there's no interest there, right? There's no extra intrigue to tolerating someone or putting up with them. It's like a collective eye roll to the importance of diversity. And so I think inclusive leaders are insanely curious about their people and their stakeholders and their customers, and really want to understand, have no assumptions, right, about the reality of what life is like for all those people, that they just go do the work of figuring it out, right? They're always doing that investigation. I think a second characteristic is a balance of humility and security to really expand the decision-making tent. Like, just as a leader in particular, your expertise has been rewarded and gotten you to where you are. And so then you naturally think, well, I have this expertise, I make good choices, and I can make all these choices. But the reality is that, particularly as you look at building inclusive perspectives around you, you have to have the humility to say, and the security in yourself to say, I might not have the answer to this. I might not understand how other people engage with this decision. And the third thing that I would say is actually having access to the data. So I think a holdover from quotas and affirmative action and even equal employment opportunity is leaders seem to be afraid of their data. And if asked, they often think that they have like more diversity on their teams or more diversity in their organizations than they actually have. There's this great data point that says when women make up 17% of the room, men say that they're half. And when women make up 33% of the room, men say that they're an overwhelming majority. It is this idea that we just assume that more diversity exists than actually exists. Right? And so as a leader, it is your responsibility to have actual data so that you know what your gap is as it relates to diversity on your team or with your stakeholders or across your company. And it also, like, you would never try to obtain something without setting a quantifiable goal. So you'd never say, like, I want to lose some weight. You'd say, I want to lose 20 pounds. And I think with diversity and inclusion, we need to add that level of specificity, right? It's not like, I just want to be more diverse. It's like, no, I don't actually have a person of color on my leadership team. And we need to change that. Or I don't have a woman in any technical field at our organization. They're all in HR. I need to change that, right? And so you have to have the data to know what progress there is to make.
I think that's kind of like a natural tendency, Pam. When I used to teach, I'd always ask my students to tell me what the population of the United States was by race and ethnicity, and I would never get it right, ever, never get it right. And it was always an overestimation of African Americans, Asian Americans, and Hispanics, and an underestimation of the white population. And it just goes to show you about perception, right? Which is where we started our conversation today.
So that brings us to, I think, what's going to be our last question. I recognize that we're a little over. It's 5:02. Just trying to fit in this last question, given that we were booted off. And so I would love, Dr. Garcia, if you could start with just giving us a few practical strategies to cultivate a more inclusive perspective. I think that would be helpful to our viewers.
Sure. I think, one of the important things that we've identified in our conversation today is just an overall recognition and awareness of bias, right? So I think, sort of an important first step as you're thinking about where do I go from here is I have to first recognize what I have as my own biases, and I have to be aware of those. I think another sort of strategy for thinking about how to create more inclusiveness, whether we're talking about perspectives or environments, is that I think we all have to be good, active listeners. I often am in a room where I'm the only woman, the only person of color talking to a bunch of people who are not. And you can tell when they've tuned out. You can tell when they're not listening anymore. And that, I think, influences our ability to be successful at creating environments where others feel like they belong and that they're included. So I'd say, okay, recognizing bias, being a good listener. And then I think holding people accountable. Like, I think that's another important strategy for creating more inclusive perspectives or environments, right? Like, you have to hold others in your life accountable for these things as well. And I think, if we're not being that voice of change, that, we're not going to have much luck changing anything.
Thank you.
I might add some just finer points, right? Like restating some of this, but I think one of the challenges with identifying our biases is that people think like, okay, so if I sit here, I just think really hard about it. Am I going to come up with that list, right? And it's hard to actually get at what your biases might be. So, Harvard has a project called the Implicit Association Test. They've aggregated that research into a book that was published about a decade ago called Blind Spot and recently released an update on that data. It is not the be all end all. It doesn't mean you're a bad person, right? Just to reiterate, but it is an interesting starting point, right? If you take some of these implicit association tests around weight and gender and disability and orientation and of course race, to see what is, to just ask yourself the question, what does this mean? I think even as you look at how you react to certain things, I've done some activities where we look at Humans of New York. I don't know if you're familiar with that social media platform, but what is wonderful about Humans of New York is you see the picture, and if you were to write a story on the picture, it never matches the actual story, right? But going through some of those profiles and even journaling or taking some notes on, is this very different from what I expected? Do I feel anger about this, or sympathy or empathy? Am I shocked? Am I surprised, right? Just really being intentional about how you consume information and stories, and thinking critically about what your visceral natural response to those stories is, I think can bring to light biases that otherwise wouldn't be surfaced until your new employee told you she was pregnant, right? Like, it wouldn't be surfaced until you face the moment. And the final thing on that same vein, I'll say, is really, I mean, many of us spend a lot of time on social media, whether we do that professionally or personally. And I think doing an audit of the voices across your social media is really critical. There are just so many incredible voices. Like, I do not actually have, I know I'm acquainted with trans people, but I don't have a trans person like directly in my network. But as someone who spends most of my time talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and who cares about it quite deeply, I have a lot of trans voices in my social media, so I can at least understand their perspective, right? And hear their words instead of making assumptions about what that might be. So I think really proactively building your social media, because that's a place where people are choosing to express their perspective. And it's not, you're not putting, like, I don't put labor on those people to be my trans friend and explain stuff to me. I instead tap into what they're putting out into the world and use that for my growth. And I guess the final thing I will say is to always ask the question, right? Like, always, as a decision is being made, or, always ask a question, like, why are we the people at the table? Who else should be at this table, right? Who else is impacted by this decision? And it's hard, I think in organizational cultures, we don't want to be like the consistent disruptor. But I think asking questions is a way to ensure that we're expanding, at the tables where we are.
Thank you so much, Pamela. I appreciate that insight. And so to close, I think it's important that we continue to walk this journey. And as we do so, I think some of the things that we talked about here today is that we should continue to reflect on our own biases and also on our own triggers. And that we should also take steps to diversify our personal and professional networks, leave our egos at the door, right? And so let's practice doing a lot more listening and exploring, right? Self-exploration than we do talking. And then also, I think Pamela touched on it quite a bit. Just embracing a respectful level of curiosity, a healthy level of curiosity, and doing that in a respectful way, right? And so becoming a student of life, not expecting folks to do the work for you, but being open to listening and being open to learning more about other folks' lived experiences. And so, in closing, I would love to thank both Dr. Garcia and Pamela Fuller for their insight into and expertise on embracing an inclusive perspective. I also want to thank all of our participants, supporters, and allies for joining us to explore this subject. And lastly, I'd like to thank Geico for sponsoring the discussion. To support future programming by donating and to keep in tune with upcoming events, you can visit our website at aauw.org. And we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you both so much, and thank you all for participating.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.